Hey guys, it's Bella, and in this video I am going to talk with you briefly about a rather worrying story coming out of France. So this is Le Monde journal, and prefer to get these things at least from a French source if I can. You may have heard in the news that the French are banning gender neutral or inclusive language, and this appears indeed to be the case because their Minister for Education, Jean-Michel Blanquer, has put out a missive telling people not to use the median point in schools. A circulation published on, I believe that's Thursday, banned the use in classes of inclusive writing, particularly the medial point. And it sort of concerns mostly the feminization of words and their functions. So forgive me if I've translated a couple of things incorrectly, but I'm showing this to show that it's a real thing. It's actually coming from the French government that they're doing this. So what's his argument? So he's saying here, oops, let me scroll up and find it. So here are the quotes where he's talking about it. He's saying that the complexity and instability of these inclusive means of writing in the French language constitute obstacles to the acquisition of the language as it is written, which is very interesting. And in this publication on the 6th of May, in the official bulletin of national education, he wrote, it's necessary to ban the use of inclusive literature which uses notably the medial point to make the feminine and the masculine forms appear simultaneously in a word used in the masculine when it is used in a generic sense, so a gender neutral sense. Forgive me, any francophones watching, if I have translated this incorrectly. So what's he talking about? What is the medial point? So we've got an article about this on Wikipedia. So it's down here on inclusive language. Here, oops, in Sardinian, in Occitan, inclusive language. Here we go. So this is saying that in the French language you have grammatical gender, so words are masculine or feminine. We have this in English to some extent. So we have waiter and we have waitress in English. And in French, however, this is much more common and it applies to adjectives also. So as an example, you have an expression, les salariés, les salariés. And the extra E there is telling you that it is feminine. So this would be the salaried men and this would be the salaried women. Now, some people in France, in order to be inclusive, they write this as that. So including the E sign in brackets, a bit like how we would sometimes say men or women, or actors slash actresses, waiters slash waitresses. And the medial point that he's referring to is, instead of writing it with round brackets, writing it like that to indicate that the word is not plural, something like this. This is the thing, and this is now banned in French schools. French teachers will no longer be allowed to use this. And later on, here's another one of his arguments. He says, inclusive writing modifies respect for the rules of agreement, of grammar, usually attended in the cadre of teaching programs. So he's saying that inclusive language is going to somehow threaten French grammatical education. This seems to be his concern in general. And lastly, he makes a rather, I think, insincere maybe point about students with dyslexia at some point in here. It's very interesting. But my point is that this is a real attack on free speech that's happening right now. This is literally cancel culture. The French Minister of Education is forbidding students from hearing certain words being spoken in France. Now, this isn't something that I have as much of a right to comment on. I'm not a francophone. I'm not from France. But as somebody who's part of the West that includes France, I think it's a worthwhile thing to talk about at least a bit. Although I acknowledge that my perspective is going to be limited by not being a French person. But there are some historical contexts involving the French language which give some important context to this story. France, like many European countries, did not until the modern era have a single standard language that was spoken across it, especially not that was spoken by government. There were instead tons of regional languages. And the Valois French monarchy and dynasty tried to cultivate the Parisian dialect as the standard dialect of France. And in a gradual process since then, most especially codified with Napoleon, who had difficulties with his generals communicating from one side of France to the other. So French political authorities have tried to standardize French in the whole country around Parisian French as a means of uniting the country. So the French have this cultural concern with keeping the language standardized, because to not do so in some ways raises the historical spectre of disunity and of the country falling apart. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the case, but I'm explaining this to give some background as to why the French people might be feeling this way. There is also in France an institution called the Immortals, and I believe it's one of the oldest language regulatory institutions in the world. And what their job is these people meet every so often, and they are a formal committee of French academics and experts who decide what is and is not acceptable French. So they rule on new words, new grammatical features. To my knowledge, this inclusive language is a relatively new thing and has not yet been accepted by the Immortals, and so it's not part of standard French. And that's why when he says that the use of inclusive language constitutes a barrier to learning standard French, it is a barrier to learning standard French because it contradicts the standard French promoted by the Immortals as this long-standing institution which has been going since the 1600s of the French language. And this is a point that I particularly find a bit cynical. So he says, putting these points in the middle of words is an attack on the transmission of our language for all. For example, for dyslexic students. So I understand where this is coming from. We certainly don't want to make things more difficult for students who have reading disorders, but the French language and the English language, partly because of French influence, is really difficult to read and write. And something like a spelling reform would go much more for students who have dyslexia than not putting middle points in. Because I'm not dyslexic, so maybe tell me if I've got this wrong, but learning this in school, learning the middle point, either with the dot here or with the brackets as here, I feel to a dyslexic person that would just be one more thing that they have to do, like with so many other points of punctuation that they learn. I don't feel it would be a dramatically more of a barrier than any which already exists for a dyslexic person in learning to speak French or English, for that matter. So that's all I have to say about this, really. I mean, I obviously disagree with this policy. I think that teachers should be able to use, not only able to use, with the exception of obviously profanity and such, whatever language they want to teach children. But I think it's important to teach children language that's going to reflect the world that they go into. And I imagine that this kind of inclusive language is the way of the future in France. I don't know. Things may go the other way. But if that's the case, teachers should be preparing their students to understand and engage with that rather than being banned and cancelled for their free speech by the literal government, by the education minister. I want to emphasize again This man is literally attacking free speech in France for government officials. So thank you guys for watching. I hope I've at least brought this issue to people's attention more. If you want to talk more about inclusive language, say with regards to English, feel free to let me know in the comments and I'll make a video on that. Until then, thank you guys for watching and have a good day. Bye.